Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is a special live stream episode of Dispatches. The impact of Russia's war in Ukraine isn't isolated to Europe. As the US and NATO pour weapons into a Ukrainian insurgency, the risk for confrontation between nuclear armed powers is rising. Does this mark the end of unipolarity and the beginning of a multipolar world? If so, what does that mean? How will support for Ukrainian insurgency feed into the rise of the global far right? What will be the impact of war and sanctions on Russia, which are already causing wheat, fertilizer, and fuel prices to skyrocket? And what should be the anti imperialist left's position on these major developments? To help me make sense of it all and frame these events in their global context, I'm joined by Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and author of Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA, Coups, and Assassinations. Vijay, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Great to be with you. And my God, that's a tall order to talk about, but let's see where we go.
Right. It is a tall order to talk about, but it's so necessary right now. And I think people are really hungry for this sort of analysis. But before we get to it, I just want to remind people who are watching that you can listen to every episode of this show anywhere you get podcasts, and you can support Breakthrough News and all of our wonderful content here by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. So Vijay, well, let's get to it. I think, a good place to begin, because I don't think it can be said enough how we got here. So let's talk about how we got here. And I mean, briefly, we don't have to go too deep into it, but it's still going to be a big question. For most people, the history of this conflict in Ukraine started on February 24th, and all they know is that that's when the Russians invaded. But, to really understand why this happened, we have to know how far back we should go. So how far back do you think we should go to explain this conflict? Should we go to 2014? Do we go to 2008? Do we go to 1991? Or do we go all the way back to 1917? Where do you think this conflict started?
I mean, we could go back to the 13th century. We could go back to the origin of Ukraine and Russia and so on. One thing we should recognize immediately is when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, it fell apart pretty peacefully by and large. In other words, the main Soviet Socialist Republic, Russia, essentially, which is such a big part of the USSR, essentially allowed the other republics to go without much violence at all. Ukraine went its way, Georgia went its way, the Central Asian republics went their way, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Relatively peaceful transition, actually. But there was something that was, in a sense, waiting to happen. And that was the fact that there were a large number of Russian-speaking people in many of these new countries. And it didn't take long. The first big rumble, major rumble, was in South Ossetia in 2008 in Georgia, where there was a conflict between the Georgian government and the Russian government. Now, the problem is that when you have these new nations come into being, like Ukraine, for instance, it has to deal with minorities. During the USSR, even though there was a Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic, everybody there was a Soviet citizen. Their citizenship was Soviet, not Ukrainian. It was not linked to a ethnicity, as it were. So there were protections for Ukrainians, Russians, Moldovians, Lithuanian. I'm talking about people who spoke those languages. When the Ukraine situation, after 1991, particularly 94, when Ukraine was declared to be an independent country, the issue of the minorities was on the table. I mean, it's not something to disregard. There's a deep cultural problem. And this development of Ukrainian nationalism rubbed against the fact that there were not only Russian speakers, but there was Roma populations, Hungarians, Lithuanians, Moldovan, and so on. This was accelerated after 2014, particularly under the administration of President Petro Poroshenko, who drove a right-wing Ukrainian nationalist policy, and that really fueled the conflict in the Donbass region, where there's the majority of Russian speakers. But let's not forget the Roma are closer to the western border of Ukraine with Hungary and so on. They also experienced a lot of this Ukrainian ultra-right nationalism attacked by the ultra-right and so on. There are many origins to this, Rania. You know, you're sitting in Beirut. There is not one origin to the civil war that started in the 1970s. There are many authors of it.
Right.
People who seek a single origin don't actually understand that human history is very much more complicated. Doesn't start in 2014. Certainly doesn't start on the 24th of February 2022. This is a much longer conflict, but I would say that this conflict was certainly accelerated in 2014. And I think the way in which the Russian entry took place has certainly deepened and complicated the conflict.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, when we talk about obviously the conflict in Ukraine, we can't talk about it without talking about NATO expansion. Do you think Russia was right to feel threatened by NATO expansion? Was NATO really going to attack Russia or use Ukraine as some sort of base from which to launch an invasion? And I guess on top of that, why do you think, and this is just something that you can speculate, obviously, none of us are able to ask Putin this, but why do you think Putin did this and why now? Right? Because obviously this conflict has been going on for the last 8 years and NATO expansion has been going on for the last 30 years or longer,
Yeah,
actually, if you want to go back to its origins.
I'm glad you raised the question of NATO. But again, it's very much more complicated than is commonly talked about. NATO was set up in 1949 as a quote unquote defensive alliance. Basically, it was the United States' attempt to secure Western Europe in the US camp against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. That's what NATO is. It's a kind of Trojan horse for UN power in Europe. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, yes, people did say, well, maybe NATO should be shut down. Interestingly, both the Russian government of Boris Yeltsin from 1991 to 1999 and many of the governments of Eastern Europe sought to have a new equation with Europe. Now, they sought that equation, Rania, in two different ways. One was economically and politically. They sought it through the European Union. Number of them joined the European Union, including, of course, Poland and so on. And the second way they sought an equation was through NATO. There was pressure on many of these countries. I'm not talking from outside, from within, to join NATO. Now, here's the interesting thing. Russia joins the European process, becomes firstly a partner of the G7, which was expanded to the G8, and Russia in 1994 becomes a NATO partner of peace, just like Ukraine. Furthermore, in 2004, when 8 bordering countries, many of them bordering countries of Russia, joined NATO, including the Baltic states, that's up there, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. When they joined NATO, Sergei Lavrov participated in the ceremony to welcome them into NATO. And Jens Stoltenberg, and this is 2004, mind you, Jens Stoltenberg said at that time that, look, we have no ulterior motive against Russia. Russia has no problem with our expansion. Putin started to criticize NATO in 2007, only in 2007. So there is a way in which this NATO issue has also been blown out of proportion, because France and Germany said Ukraine can never be part of NATO because there's a border dispute. Well, that's interesting. Right. There's a divide inside Europe. The question wasn't NATO expansion by itself. That's not exactly the issue. When Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Intermediate Forces Treaty, the INF, the mid-range nuclear treaty, very important treaty. Donald Trump withdrew the United States from that in 2018. Very soon after that, Putin withdrew from the INF. This was catastrophic for the arms control, very delicate arms control apparatus that's out there. When Trump withdraws the United States from the INF, Putin starts to say, listen, now we fear that you're going to place intermediate nuclear weapons on the borders of Russia, and the flight time for your mid-range nuclear warheads into Moscow is going to be minutes. And
Mm.
therefore, we fear annihilation, and therefore, we are against the expansion of NATO. So, really, the question is not merely the expansion of NATO. The question is all these other things happening at the same time, including Biden's pledging to spend $100 billion on a brand new missile facility, which is not got name, but it's essentially Minuteman 4. They're spending $100 billion on that. And that's what Putin is reflecting on. There's another theme, Rania, which is not talked about enough. You see, in 2014, the Russians went and brought Crimea into Russia. I say brought because there was a majority in Crimea that voted quickly to join Russia. I understand that this is controversial, but Crimea entered Russia. The reason Russia intervened in Crimea in 2014 is Crimea was one of Russia's two warm water ports. It's in Sevastopol for the Russian Navy. The other one is in Syria, in Tartus, in Latakia. And therefore, in September 2015, Russia intervenes in Syria. These two interventions, Crimea and Sevastopol, are to preserve Russia's only two warm water ports. A lot of this intervention is taking place around Crimea, and it's not getting discussed enough. Over the course of the last year, the Russians have complained that the government of Ukraine has cut off water supply into Crimea, and the Russians had to drive tankers of water across the one bridge that connects Russia with Crimea, with the Crimean section. So what I see the Russian forces doing is, yes, they entered from Belarus, they entered from Russian territory, and they came north from Crimea, but they're trying to create a land bridge
Mm.
from Donetsk and Luhansk into Crimea. So I think there are three things that are driving this Russian military intervention. One is to protect these Russian populations in Donetsk, Luhansk, and other parts, and to what they call denazify Ukraine. That's one war aim. Second one is to make sure that these intermediate missiles are not going to enter into Ukraine or into other parts of Eastern Europe. It's actually a message Putin is sending to other countries. And the third is to build a land bridge. I think this is what the Russians are up to. Now, again, I'm merely telling you what I think is happening. I don't have a hotline to, the Kremlin.
Right. No, and I think those are all really important points, and it makes perfect sense. But I do want to step away from this particular war for a moment, and obviously the horror and death and moral issues associated with it, and look at this geopolitically, kind of like John Mearsheimer might be staring at a board game of Risk or something. And I want to talk about Russia's invasion in that context and if it's actually changed the world order, if it might lead to a multipolar or rebalanced world. And, on the Socialist program with Brian Becker, which, is on Breakthrough News every Wednesday. Last week, Brian Becker and Eugene Puryear made the case that a multipolar world is not by itself an answer to unipolarity. And actually, Vijay, you made that point with me when we did an episode for this show, Dispatches, a few months ago, specifically about multipolarity. But that it's not in and of itself an answer to unipolarity, even if it's a step forward. It could even mean capitalist states being more willing to confront each other militarily, no longer restrained by the fear of the West. And even in a multipolar world, Western imperialism still is one of the poles, right? And it's extraordinarily aggressive, and especially because it's unwilling to become a peer of any other poles. So, does the Ukraine war mark, in your opinion, the beginning of a more multipolar world, or do you think it's more of a global shift to unmanaged chaos, in which case it would actually be more of a negative development? How do you see that aspect of this playing out?
I think people who focus on the Ukraine situation as the beginning of something new are revealing a classic Eurocentric perspective. Because, in fact, I would say, Rania, that this development starts again in Syria in 2015 when those Russian planes enter Syria. Because, that was something different. This is the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union that a country has militarily challenged the United States. And I don't mean direct military confrontation, But a country came in and said to the United States, no, we will not allow you to bomb Damascus. We will not allow you to overthrow the Syrian government. That was a key moment in September 2015. Since, let's say, the US entry into Panama in 1989, which is really the beginning of a new period, and then the US smashing of Iraq in 1991, the smashing and breakup of Yugoslavia through the 90s, the attack on Afghanistan, and you know the story. It goes all the way, in fact, all the way to Libya in 2011, when Russia allowed the West to have a Security Council resolution, UN Resolution 1973. That was 2011 March. But in September 2015, when the Russians entered Damascus, when those planes flew in, I mean, I was sitting in Beirut, watched these planes come in, and I was thinking, what's going on? That was a big shift. Now, doesn't mean that suddenly there are multipoles, in the world and so on. But it was certainly the first time in decades that the United States had faced somebody saying, we will not actually allow you to do this. We're not saying, it's not that we are saying it's a bad thing for you to overthrow the government. Many governments said that. The South African government openly said, don't overthrow the government of Libya and so on. Many governments said that. But here, a government acted by sending military forces to say, we are creating a shield around the government in Damascus. That was the difference. And in a sense, what's happening here in Ukraine is merely a slight quantitative increase, because now the United States actually said, we will enter this conflict, directly. Remember, in Syria, initially the motive was overthrow the government in Damascus, the Assad government. After the Russian intervention, the US immediately pivoted and said, our project here is to fight ISIS, and therefore we are just going to stay on. They quickly changed the game plan. How will you change the game plan here? You said that we will protect the Kiev government. In fact, Mr. Zelensky spoke in the UK Parliament, the first foreign leader to speak to the UK Parliament. Incredible. Well, you'll have that. Now, how will you protect him? What will you do? Are you going to send US planes and land them in the international airport in Kiev? I don't think so. That's where we are. We are at a position of great shifts and rebalancing taking place. It's not clear what's going on. I very much took notice of the Chinese foreign ministry conversation with Sergei Lavrov. Mr. Wang Yi says to him, we got to get out of the Cold War mentality. I thought that was a really interesting statement. Got to get out of the Cold War mentality. Where do we go next? Well, we haven't gone out of the Cold War mentality. We're still there. Look at the way Biden and others are talking. They're talking as if they're still prosecuting, the war against the Soviet Union and so on. This is a different era. And I think that they, again, want to miscalculate. The idea that you're going to send, Hillary Clinton talking to MSNBC, I watched that clip. You're going to send money to the, neo-Nazi groups like you armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This is immoral, actually. This is immoral behavior. And, they never learn anything, these people in Washington, D.C., or in her case, in the suburbs of New York City.
Well said. But, one thing that troubles me is that, while it's great to have, I think it's a good thing to have well, it's better to have a multipolar world, maybe, obviously, and a unipolar world with this like big imperialist empire hegemon, the US, just bullying everybody is not good. So with countries like China and Russia that can limit the freedom of action that the US had in the 90s, especially, but of course throughout the 2000s, I mean, that's a good thing. But at the same time, Russia's not exactly like Cuba, right? It's not promoting revolution. It's not exporting ideas. It's not really offering alternative values. It's just like another capitalist power espousing, nationalism at most. Of course, trying to demand respect, and it's sort of like fair share of the global cake, if you will. But this means that a Russian challenge to the US, even if it succeeds, has limited ideological value, does it not?
I mean, the question that we can discuss is, what is the Russian project? I mean, I come at this. I'm a Marxist. I'm pretty old fashioned in my thinking. I understand that. And I know the limitations of it in today's world. But whatever, regardless, I still think it's important that when the Soviet Union was created, Lenin warned about great Russian chauvinism. He wrote a lot about this, said that we really need to understand minority nationalities and so on. That attitude needs to be highlighted today. I'm against all forms of ethnic chauvinism, frankly. I think all of them are hideous. And inside Ukrainian chauvinism was playing itself out under Poroshenko. They made non-Ukrainian languages not part of the state. They broke ties between the Church of Kiev and the Church of Moscow. They militarized society in a certain kind of Ukrainian nationalist way and so on. Similar things are happening inside Russia. Let's face it. There is a kind of chauvinism that's growing there. It's very unpleasant, in my opinion. Look at the chauvinism in Poland, the anti-Asian migrants. Even today, there are Africans and Asians who are being stopped at the Ukraine-Polish border, not allowed in, and so on. The chauvinisms that are growing in Western Europe, anti-Muslim attitudes in France and Germany, these are all hideous, but they're all the same. There's no high moral ground here. And that's the sad thing about these conflicts, is that we don't have high moral grounds in any of them. People should not get worked up about one side being better than the other. We're dealing with a lot of hideousness here. The
Right.
issue is, one of the reasons why it's complicated for people to wend their way around these issues is that there's a kind of frustration that I have with the way the Russian government has played this out. 8 years, 14,000 civilians had been killed in the Donbass region. 14,000 civilians. Why didn't the Russian government, because these are Russian speakers, but others could have as well, people in France could have, or the government in India could have, but India doesn't
Right.
have a moral leg to stand on. Why didn't another government come to the UN and put forward a resolution for the fact that the Minsk agreements 1 and 2 had been basically shredded by the right-wing groups, and that civilians were being killed in the Donbass? Why wasn't that made into a political issue? You know how the West made, for instance, Darfur into a political issue. People all around the world suddenly learned about Darfur.
Right.
Why wasn't the word Donbass lifted up to the word Darfur? When Zelensky said, he gave quite a heartfelt speech. He said, look, I come from a Jewish family. I'm against Nazis. At that point, Mr. Putin could have boarded one of the Russian planes, flown into Kiev, and challenged Mr. Zelensky, let's hold an international anti-fascist or anti-Nazi conference in Kiev. That kind of politics was not put forward much. And I must say, we have a lot to learn from the way the West constructs consent. You
Yeah.
don't send in tanks immediately. You have to construct consent. And it's a good sign of how these new emerging countries like Russia and China and so on, they don't really grasp the power of building consent, and that needs to be put on the table. I was actually quite shocked that the word Donbass, wasn't banged on. Like, you remember the Darfur thing. The comparison is actually opposite, in the sense that there was something happening in Darfur, but how amazingly they were able to lift it up. It's not just Darfur. Look at Libya, okay,
Aleppo, or the word
or
Aleppo.
Aleppo. Yeah,
Yeah.
Libya is a good example. The Donbass conflict took place over 8 years. 14,000 dead, 50,000 casualties. That's a UN figure. I'm sure it's underestimated. I'm sure the numbers are greater. Libya, I mean, I reported from Libya. I've known Libya for many, many years. I wrote a book about it. I understand that country a little bit. It's not that easy to understand everything. But in Libya, in February, a protest breaks out, 25th February 2011, right? Protests break out and so on. Yes, the Gaddafi government, goes to quell the protest, just as most governments do. That happened. Mahmoud Jibril comes to Benghazi. Mahmoud Jibril, by the way, was the financial advisor of the then Sheikh, or the Emir of Qatar's wife. An interesting character himself, used to work for Mr. Gaddafi. Mahmoud Jibril flies from Doha to Benghazi, arrives in Benghazi. He says, we are in a revolutionary situation. And then he tells the West, we are all getting killed by the Gaddafi government. By the way, casualties, there was nothing at that time, nothing like 14,000, 50,000 casualties and so on. But they were able to get the West to play this propaganda machine where they said there's going to be genocide in eastern Libya. And then what did the West do? Went to the UN Security Council, and at the time, as I said already, even the Russians allowed and the Chinese abstained from that. They should have vetoed that resolution 1973. They gave NATO permission to go in there and destroy the Libyan state and create what we see today. So what I'm saying is that was not done at all by the Russians, and to some extent it's because the media is essentially controlled, dominated by the Western countries. Look how quickly they've been able to get rid of Russia TV, how quickly they've been able to get rid of China or delegitimize these media outlets. So the hold that the West has on the world's imagination, you got to really understand that. If we don't understand that, we don't understand culturally how we get swept into these conflicts as if suddenly the Ukraine conflict is our conflict. There are people in Burma, where there's the persecution of the Rohingya people in Burma with their Facebook profiles showing the Ukraine flag. I mean,
it's amazing.
What is going on in the world?
It's amazing. It really is incredible, the level of it. Since you brought up manufacturing consent, I do want to say how frightening it is that just a few weeks ago, Americans did not support intervening in Ukraine. But after, what can only be considered relentless media bombardment, a recent poll is showing that a majority now actually support a no-fly zone. I just want to show this very quickly. One moment. I'm still getting technologically savvy with how to share my screen. Here we go. So this is a poll that just came out a few days ago about how a majority of Americans now support a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Some 74%, including solid majorities of Republicans and Democrats, said that the U.S. and its allies and NATO should impose a no-fly zone in Ukraine. What I thought was so interesting about this poll, Vijay, is that it also says it was not clear if respondents who supported a no-fly zone were fully aware of the risk of conflict. And majorities opposed the idea of sending American troops to Ukraine or conducting airstrikes to support the Ukrainian army, which is completely contradictory, obviously, because, I guess that's to say, can you, for those who aren't familiar with what it would mean, can you please explain what a no-fly zone would actually entail? Because clearly there's a lot of confusion about this. And the word, even the word itself, no-fly zone, right? It sounds like something humanitarian. It sounds like something good, a no-fly zone. It doesn't sound like something dangerous, but this includes so much danger. So can you please lay out what that would mean?
Well, before we get to the no-fly zone, I want to say something about these polls and so on. The president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, came out and said, let's bring people in, from all around the world to fight in Ukraine. In fact, there are reports, the London Times had a report that they were going to be paid $2,000 a day, mercenaries, to come and fight in Ukraine. $2,000 a day. I don't know who's going to pay for it, but that was the London Times. We know that in many places in Algeria and Senegal and so on, ambassadors were putting out calls for people on social media saying, come and fight in Ukraine. By the way, I just want to suggest to you a particular fact that I just talked about Senegal and Ukraine. Both Senegal and Ukraine are signatories. They are one of actually only 46 countries that signed a UN Convention against mercenaries. There is, in fact, people may not know this, a United Nations Convention against mercenaries, and Ukraine is a signatory of the UN Convention against mercenaries. It has signed, it is international law as far as Ukraine is concerned. So the president of Ukraine, by calling for mercenaries to come in, is actually violating international law by itself. It's a bad idea to have mercenaries come into a country, especially people who don't have combat experience. Look at Blackwater in Fallujah, when they shot up civilians and so on. These are people who are not trained like military. Now, I'm not saying the military is so well trained it doesn't kill civilians, okay? Because we have plenty of evidence of that. But this is even worse. You have people who have no idea what to do in a war zone coming in. And let me tell you, having been to one or two war zones myself, it is utterly confusing. And I don't know how anybody manages their mental state there. So
Right.
this is a terrible idea. It's just it's made for war crimes. And I know that 200 people have come from Croatia, most of them neo-Nazis. This is a terrible thing that's happening. Okay, so on the ground, you've got mercenaries coming in, and then in the air, you want to create a no-fly zone. This is very dangerous. The UN no-fly zone is a very specific, practice. The idea is that if one party has basically got domination of the airspace, hello, this is Israel over Palestine. If one
Right.
party has dominance over the airspace, you create a no-fly zone, and then third party, fourth party countries patrol the no fly zone to prevent that one power, Israel, from bombing the Palestinians. Wow, imagine if there was a no fly zone over Gaza. Never going to
Imagine.
happen. Never going to
No.
happen. But that's the precise idea of the no fly zone, is that you protect a civilian population because one party in a conflict has overwhelming power over the skies. That's basically the idea. Well, in Libya, as I said, the West got a no fly zone in UN Resolution 1973 and promptly violated it because they acted no longer to protect the civilians from the air in Benghazi and in Ashtabia and other cities in the east. No, they started operating as the air force of the rebels and started bombing Tripoli. That's against the no-fly zone. And that's precisely what the West does every time it gets a no-fly zone mandate.
Mm.
It exceeds it. That's a violation of the UN resolution. Nobody can hold them to account for it. That's why calling for a no-fly zone in Ukraine is very dangerous, because what it might mean, you have British planes, French planes, US planes circling Ukraine, and they'll start bombing in Lugansk, they'll start bombing in Rostov, perhaps in Russia, I don't know. And this sets up a nuclear problem, because now you have major nuclear, Gaddafi didn't have nuclear weapons. He gave up nuclear weapons in a deal with the West, and so then they recognized his government and so on, allowed oil trading to take place. If Gaddafi had nuclear weapons, you wouldn't dare to bomb Tripoli. And just one more point about that. The African Union sent a body to negotiate a ceasefire in Libya during the conflict. Actually, they wanted to go before the conflict. They were prevented. During the conflict, they arrived in Tripoli, talked to Mr. Gaddafi. Mr. Gaddafi said, let's do a ceasefire, let's end this war. Great. Then the group went to Benghazi. They met Mahmoud Jibril and others. They said, what about a ceasefire? And, the rebels said, no ceasefire. And do you know why? Because why should they have a ceasefire when the West is bombing Tripoli and the fall of Gaddafi was imminent? They were not going to have they wanted to win. They were basically they thought they would come to power in Tripoli on the wings of a F-16. As it turned out, of course, the F-16s just destroyed Libya. But that's the
Right.
fantasy, and so no-fly zone by itself, it sounds like a reasonable thing, but the practice of no-fly zones, it's not instructive. It's very dangerous as a concept. It's not a peace concept. It's a war concept.
And in this case, you would have potential confrontation between two nuclear armed states, which is so incredibly dangerous. And you mentioned the foreign fighters. I mean, thousands of these foreign fighters are flocking to Ukraine, and it's with the encouragement of Western governments and, of course, the facilitation of the Ukrainian leadership under Zelensky. And we know that the U.S. has already been arming neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine since 2014. And even if that is maybe slightly exaggerated by the Russian government, it's still a reality that mainstream media outlets in the capitalist countries have all reported on. And until recently, they had been totally honest about the fact. And of course, it makes sense because these people would probably make up a lot of these foreign fighters in this case, because who's the most ideologically motivated? People who have an ideology. And white nationalism, this sort of right-wing extremism, is quite a strong ideology. And we know already that far-right ideologues from the US and Europe have already spent time training with these people in Ukraine over the years. So you can only imagine like how many of these foreign fighters that are traveling to Ukraine are motivated by this ideology. And what's most important to point out right now, and I want to give an example of this, is just how much, since we're talking about manufacturing consent, is just how much the media is not only playing into the encouragement of people going to fight and really glorifying, oh, there's 3,000, U.S. military veterans going to fight for freedom in Ukraine. They're also whitewashing and downplaying the far-right elements in this growing Ukrainian insurgency. And I want to play a clip to this point. And I want those who are watching to focus on the blurred photo behind the Ukrainian mayor that's being interviewed in this clip. And also, of course, what he tells PBS. This is a clip from PBS that I'm going to play right now. So let's take a look.
Artem, can you tell us what happened when Russian troops came into your office?
They were demanding I recognize their authority and allow them to patrol the streets, dearm those who have weapons, and detain those who resist. In the end, I told them, just as Ukrainian soldiers told a Russian warship, go yourself.
The rejected Russians walked out holding grenades in their hands. Semenichin actually escorted them and made sure they drove away.
And do you fear that they'll come back and either occupy or try and destroy the city?
Yes, of course we are concerned, and this concern is not groundless. There's a big unit near our town, and using the weapons they have, they could destroy our town. But we are not afraid. We are ready to fight till the end, till the victorious end, to defeat these Russian cockroaches.
After the Russians left, he rallied his troops, civilians, ready to resist.
All of our cities are like this. All of our Ukraine is like this. We have weapons in our hands, we have armed up, and we are ready to kill occupiers. And thanks to the United States of America for supporting Ukraine with weapons.
So I think that is a very important clip because if you notice, like I said, if you pay attention, there's an image, a very well-known image of Stepan Bandera behind him. It's behind that mayor who just called Russians cockroaches, by the way, which also is language that should raise eyebrows if you're interviewing the mayor. But this man calls Russian cockroaches, and behind him is a very distinct, though blurred out, image of this Ukrainian Nazi, this man who collaborated, this Ukrainian nationalist who during World War II collaborated with the Nazis to kill Jews and Polish people. And that's really important because, if PBS had just Googled this man's name, and I want to show this, if they had just Googled this man's name, they would have seen this article. Let me just make sure you can see the article that I have up right now. They would have seen this article, Local Jews in Shock After Ukrainian City of Konotep Elects Neo-Nazi Mayor. And this article goes on to state that this mayor is from the Svoboda party, which is a far-right party that has neo-Nazi connections to it, and goes on to, quote people in the Jewish community in Ukraine about why they're concerned that he's become the mayor and the kinds of things he said, Heil Hitler, whatnot. Anyways, the point is, this is a clear attempt at either ignorance, pure ignorance, because maybe the PBS and the reporters are just so enamored with the Ukrainians right now and are horrified by what Russia's doing, or that's at best. At worst, this is purely propagandistic whitewashing of somebody who is in a position of power, who is far right. So I just bring all that up to say that this is just one example among many. For those who have been perusing Twitter, have seen people pointing out lots of examples in the mainstream press of trying to hide or whitewash or cover up the right-wing elements here. So I guess, Vijay, what do you have to say to this? And what do you think is the danger of having a training ground for people from the global far right to go fight and possibly get paid to fight in a war in Europe?
In 2003, United States prosecuted an illegal war. It's illegal, again, not because I'm saying so, but Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, told BBC News that it was illegal in 2004, a year later. US conducts an illegal war in Iraq in 2003. I remember well, within months, an insurgency breaks out in Iraq. It took a little while for various groups to recover themselves. Different from Ukraine, the insurgency has been going on essentially since 2014. So they're well prepared. In Iraq, they were not prepared. Anyway, they started an insurgency. US government called them terrorists, by the way, and not freedom fighters or whatever, which is what I think they're calling them now in Ukraine, fighting for their country and so on. They call them terrorists. Well, okay. And then Iraq becomes a new training ground for all kinds of global jihadists. Zarqawi, for instance, comes from the province of Zarqa in Jordan. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, you remember, will come to Iraq, set himself up, become the first major terrorist outside Afghanistan, trains a group of young people in the prisons, trains a group of young people out in Ramadi and just north of Baghdad and so on. Well, they got Zarqawi in a drone strike, but Zarqawi essentially was the ancestor of ISIS. I mean, from Zarqawi comes ISIS. There is no ISIS without Zarqawi. Zarqawi is a product of the US war in Iraq. Well, let's flip the whole story. Ukraine could become essentially combination Afghanistan and Iraq for the neo-Nazis, because just like in Afghanistan, but actually more in Iraq, it's not the case in Afghanistan, more in Iraq. Iraq drew in all kinds of hardened jihadis, including, by the way, from Xinjiang. I saw them there. Then they end up going to Idlib and so on. Drew in people from all over. They were trained in Iraq in fighting the Americans alongside the Ba'ath, ex-demobilized Ba'ath fighters and so on. And then they spread to Libya. They go to Tunisia, to Algeria, and so on. Well, now imagine this. In comes a group of neo-Nazis to train with this fellow and his great support for Bender. And shame on PBS, by the way, for a dishonest report there, because they should have talked about what is in fact on the record, that the man is a neo-Nazi. And when he uses the word cockroach, the reporter just sits there and doesn't say, excuse me, is that the way to talk about human beings? The reporter who's a liberal doesn't challenge, and then they say, state affiliated news media. Come on, give me a break. That reporter from PBS doesn't have the guts to challenge a neo-Nazi. That's hardly reporting. You got to ask people, what do you... I mean, I reported from an Al-Qaeda camp in Syria, and I had an argument with the emir about why the Christians were apostates in his eyes. I was terrified they were going to kill me. You know why they were so nice to me is that we shared a love for Hindi music. He wanted to sing some Hindi music songs to me and so on. But I'm not going to sit there and allow him to go on and on about, how the Christians are essentially below human and etc. I'm not saying I'm better than any other reporter, but it's shocking to have a PBS reporter with all the power of the US government behind him not challenge this fellow. Anyway, look, Ukraine could well become the Iraq of neo-Nazis. What Iraq became for the formation of ISIS, you could see neo-Nazi groups go in there and train. My God, that's a nightmare. Because if you thought that it was bad having the jihadis go and create all kinds of trouble in Mali, in Algeria, all kinds of trouble, what they got up to after the training they received in Iraq and then in Turkey, in the Turkish borderlands and so on. Imagine what these fellows will do across Europe. If the Europeans are so worried about the French, that train bombings and so on, imagine what the neo-Nazis will do if they are trained in Ukraine and let loose. I mean, the United States and its allies better introspect now, and we need to put it on the record now. In 10 years, I don't want to hear them say, we think this through. Seriously, if you say that in 10 years, please, somebody, please, I beg you, archive this clip. I am saying it today. Today is the 8th of March, International Working Women's Day 2022. I am saying that in 10 years, if you have neo-Nazis streaming out of Ukraine, do not allow the Americans, the French, do not allow them to say, we did not anticipate this. Please save this clip.
Yes, no, that was well said. I just real quick, just when you're talking, just lean back a little bit from the microphone because I think it's bleeding through a little bit. But no, very, very well said, Vijay. It's I think we should cut that and just play that in 5 years. I don't want that to have to be the case, but it seems like there's zero concern about what the ramifications could be for everything you just described. I also want to, before we kind of get back to talking about how this is impacting the sort of global order, I very quickly want to touch on another element of the sort of media propaganda around this war, and that's the role of Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine himself. And I think it's interesting, you know, that he's actually playing this crucial role in rallying the world around escalation. I don't blame him. I mean, his country was invaded, even though he, of course, did participate in helping escalate to bring us to where we are at. You know, and from his vantage point, he's doing whatever he can to, you know, help his people. But also, he's an actor, and he's a good one. I actually want to show a clip from one of his most famous TV shows where he, of course, starred in as the president of Ukraine, which is what he did before he became the actual president of Ukraine, because I think this is such an interesting dynamic to the story because of the role he's playing now. So let me share this. I promise one of these days I will get faster at doing this. Here it is. Okay, so this is Zelensky playing on his TV show the role of the president of Ukraine. And I thought this clip in particular, which some people who are watching may have already seen, was really interesting.
Hello?
Good morning, Mr. Kolaborodka. Can I connect you with Angela Merkel?
Yes, you can connect.
Hello. My congratulations. We decided to take your country to the European Union.
Oh, fuck! Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, wow! Oh, you know, I'm so happy. Yes. Thank you very much. All the Ukrainians and all of our country, we've been waiting for this so much time.
Ukrainians?
Yes, Ukrainians.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's a mistake. I was calling to Montenegro.
Montenegro. Nice. Okay. Yeah, my congratulations. Yes, to Montenegro. Bye-bye. Fuck! You fucking Putin!
So that's actually pretty funny. That's actually pretty funny, and I have to say it's pretty well done. But that's what Zelensky was doing before he became president. He played one on TV, and I think that's actually really interesting. I heard a comparison made to almost like that's a great way to run for president is to play one on television. And that, you know, I've heard the argument made before that one thing that might have prepared Americans for having their first Black president was, you know, 24 was one of the most popular shows in America, you know, before Barack Obama was president, and that the president in that show was a Black man. And anyways, there's something to be said about seeing someone on TV and president and then them becoming one, plus the fact that he is a performer. And so I guess I raised that just to, you know, put it to you, because we also know from a New York Times article that was published a couple of days ago that that lobbying firms in DC are actually providing services to Zelensky and to Ukraine free of charge right now, which is, by the way, one of the reasons, like as you were talking about with the West being so savvy at pushing its agenda through the media, that's one of the reasons why you see people wrapping themselves in the Ukrainian flag in countries all around the world, is because of this particular media campaign. So what do you think this says about the role of performers, if you will, like Zelensky, in the drive to war in this age?
I mean, we do live in a TV kind of, or let's say a virtual world of images and so on. But the question isn't just a performer. You know, look, the Prime Minister of Pakistan was a former cricket player, extraordinarily popular figure and so on. So many people come out of different careers and become heads of government. Ronald Reagan was an actor. The issue isn't actually even Zelensky. Actually, he is relatively unimportant here, if you take my meaning. The question is how the institutions of the international media manufacture heroes and manufacture villains. You know, how villains are manufactured might actually be more important than how heroes are talked about. You know, for instance, Mr. Putin. People forget that Mr. Putin was an associate of Boris Yeltsin. And when he first comes to power, he's actually lionized as this guy who's going to be an efficient bureaucrat, comes former KGB, and he's got all this history. It's close to the West, and at the time he was very much interested in the European project and so on. And then suddenly everything changes. Mr. Putin becomes Hitler. Saddam Hussein, okay, in the 1980s, US officials, Bob Dole, for instance, goes to Baghdad, sits with Saddam Hussein, tells Saddam Hussein on the record, tells Saddam Hussein that we have told the press in the United States, the Washington Post and others, not to write negative stories about Iraq because you are fighting for us a great war against Iran. This is Bob Dole, on the record. It's there, reported in the Washington Post and in the New York Times. He tells Saddam publicly, we're going to make sure the press in the US gives you a good chit. You're going to come off looking like roses for fighting against the Iranians. And then just like this, they're able to switch the way in which Saddam is portrayed, and he becomes, guess who? Hitler. Leo Strauss, the philosopher, right-wing philosopher at University of Chicago, wrote a book in 1953 where he coined a phrase called reductio ad Hitlerium, like reductio ad absurdum. The reduction to Hitler. He talked about the concept of false equivalences. He says that it's becoming very easy to say you are like Hitler. And what the argument Strauss was making was because Hitler's a vegetarian, you can say, well, then vegetarianism is bad. Or because Hitler liked dogs, you can say, well, dogs are bad. That was the argument Strauss was trying to make, is this reduction to Hitler. But in recent times, this reduction to Hitler has performed a media role of delegitimizing people completely. And then the neo-Nazis in Ukraine can be actually anti-fascist because Putin is now Hitler. Or the Al-Qaeda groups in fighting in not Al-Qaeda as such, but the anti-Saddam groups that were fighting in Iraq can suddenly become freedom fighters against who? Against Hitler. So there is this way, it's not the actor who actually he is doing something special, but an entire media apparatus now exists to construct people as heroes and delegitimize people. I mean, look at the way they so cleverly delegitimized Julian Assange. Just like this, the media went after him. One day, 2009, he's winning awards and so on. When they released the State Department cables, and particularly that video called Collateral Murder, the whole image of Assange shifted. Suddenly he became this horrible person. United States government indicted him in 2010. In fact, we have a record in 2010 of US officials essentially calling for his assassination. This is even before the sexual assault case starts in Sweden. This is on the record. How quickly they are able to use the media, the same PBS type people, who gutlessly don't call out a Nazi for being a Nazi. These same people will lionize and then delegitimize, just like this. Got to be really vigilant about what the media, how the media operates. I know this personally. There was an attempt recently to basically portray me as a genocide denier. Goes like this, 5 or 6 articles appear, people start to say, oh, he's a genocide denier, and then that's it, you're a genocide denier. You cannot actually enough times deny that you are a genocide denier. You get, essentially, it's a hair shirt that you have to wear. Now, that's just the price of trying to speak against power. They will try to do all kinds of things. That's okay. I understand that. In this case, again, it's not an entirely monumental thing because this is one person and so on. But when you paint an entire country like Russia as murderous, authoritarian, let's sanction all Russians. Let's not allow Russian restaurants to function. Let's not allow a Russian pianist to get a fellowship in Dublin. When you reach this stage, it's so dangerous how this anti-Russian thing has exploded. It's a demonstration of how powerful the media is.
Yeah, and it really is. It is frightening. It is frightening how, like you said, it's like a switch. You just have to flick a switch, and now everybody hates Russians, and they all have to be purged from good society. just for the mere fact that they're Russian. Assad's Hitler, Putin's Hitler. Everyone we don't like is Hitler. And speaking of a demonized country, I did want to, just to get back to some of the more serious, more global context here, I did want to ask you your thoughts on the fact that, we saw that Biden, just before we started recording, announced that the US would be banning imports of Russian oil, which, we already saw that the price of oil has gone up dramatically, and that's actually going to make it go up higher. Of course, the US has to replace that oil. It's only about 10% of what the US imports, but we saw a couple days ago, the US actually sent a senior delegation to Venezuela, of all places, which has been under US attack for the last 20 years, but especially the last 10, to discuss potential oil purchases to replace the Russian oil. So I'm curious, do you think that the US can tempt Venezuela away from Russia and into its embrace after so many years of literally killing people with sanctions? And those sanctions are, of course, still there.
Look, Venezuela is a country, 40 odd million people, under immense sanctions in very difficult situation and so on. If there's an opportunity for Venezuela to sell oil into the open market, if the United States is willing to buy it, I think that's well and good. Venezuela needs the resources right now. I don't think one should take a narrow perspective on this. It's not a betrayal of what the Russians have done for Venezuela or anything like that. We have to understand that they are facing great privations and have very bravely stood up against the sanctions. And I doubt that they will, give in to the United States. But if there's an opportunity to sell oil, I think they should take it, because they need the hard currency reserves and so on. And they should also make a deal. They should say, you got to cut this, that, and the other. You got to, lift the boot off Venezuela. I think that's legitimate. And I'm sure the Russians would advise them to do the same. The issue isn't actually the US asking in Venezuela for this. The issue is Europe is getting destroyed. It's
Right.
not just, you rightly said in the beginning, it's not just the oil coming into the natural gas coming for heating. It's also to make fertilizer. Food production is going to collapse in Europe. Bread prices have already spiked. This is all very dangerous for Europeans. I mean, the Europeans need to think about their subordination to US foreign policy. When is Europe going to have its independence? It's funny. The United States fought a revolution against Britain, no taxation without representation. The Europeans need to stand up and say, no, being the frontline state for the United States without our own interests being met. They will actually suffer the most in this, is the Europeans. There's talk now of bringing natural gas from UAE, from Qatar and other places. This is liquefied natural gas. Let me tell you, it'll be 10 times the price of piped natural gas coming from Nord Stream 2. Plus, you can't do it today. You have to build terminals for liquid. I know this because in India, Enron, you remember Enron? You may not remember Enron. Enron Corporation, that fraud from Texas, was building a liquefied natural gas plant and terminal in Dabhol, Maharashtra, which it was totally sunk. Ridiculous project. That's what the United States is now promising the Europeans, an Enron type deal to bring liquefied natural gas from UAE and Qatar. And so it's ridiculous. You have the pipes ready to bring Russian gas. And by the way, during this whole conflict, Rania, Russian gas was continuing to enter Europe, and Russian gas prices went up. So the Russians actually made money selling natural gas to the Europeans during this whole conflict, because Europe has no choice but to buy natural
40%.
gas.
Some of them get 40% from the Russians. That doesn't even include the oil. It's just the natural gas. And also, it's interesting, too. I mean, the sanctions that they immediately placed on the Russian airlines, and then also not allowing them to fly into their airspace. Then Russia said, well, you can't fly in ours. So now you actually see European and American airlines canceling flights because they can't fly over Russian airspace. There's a blowback from these sanctions. I mean, obviously, the people hurt first and foremost by these sanctions will be 144 million Russians. And I just very quickly want to point out that our leaders are not shying away from saying that this is purely collective punishment. I want to quote Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying recently, this isn't the Russian people's war, but the Russian people will suffer the consequences of their leaders' choices. So that is purely like straight up collective punishment, which is a violation of international law. But we know the US is already doing this to so much of the world. But what you're talking about is the blowback on Europe in particular and the rest of the world. I'm talking to you from Lebanon right now. The wheat stores in Lebanon were destroyed in the Beirut port blast back in 2020. Lebanon gets 70% of its wheat from Ukraine. It gets another 15% from Russia. And like most of the developing world, by the way, a lot of the wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. And so now you're going to have a lot of the developing world dealing with food shortages and the price. More importantly, they're talking about the price of wheat potentially collapsing. You have the price of oil skyrocketing, which is just going to affect everyone around the world. And you have talk now of a potential for a global recession as a result of this. I mean, it's like, are the leaders in the West who are trying to punish Russia even considering the consequences of this globally? It doesn't seem like they are, because it looks like it's going to be pretty severe.
Well, you mentioned wheat coming from Ukraine and Russia. Let's just put it in the big picture. 39% of the world's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. 39%. That is not a trivial number. We know, you and I, we know that the so-called Arab Spring started because of rising bread prices in Tunisia and Egypt. It was the spike because there had been a problem with the Russian wheat harvest the previous year. The entire Arab Spring was premised on rising wheat prices. Just wait and see what's going to happen when energy prices go up again, when wheat prices go up, and we still are dealing with the COVID inflation effect. All these things together, let's see these great masterminds of the world, the so-called international community, deal with all this. They have opened worse than Pandora's box. Can they deal with it? Can they manage it? I don't think so.
I don't think so either. And I'm curious, how do you explain the positions of countries like, for example, India, the UAE, Israel, and others who've chosen not to fully condemn the Russians, which I think has actually been quite a shock to the Americans, because I think the Americans always thought that these are our friends, these are our allies, they'll do what we say. And in this case, they haven't.
I think there are different reasons in each of them. We forget that Israel, for instance, is also a Russian country. After fall of the Soviet Union, there was an enormous exodus of Russian Jews to Israel. And, when you arrive in Tel Aviv airport, there are signs. And because of the apartheid nature of Israel, there are signs in Hebrew and Russian and not in Arabic. And Hebrew, Russian, and English, actually, not in Arabic. Russian is basically a major language in Israel. You can't forget that. It's a lot of it is because of that reason, because there's so many Russians in Israel, and they're actually quite powerful in the far right wing. Many of the far right wing Zionist parties are actually Russian parties, and they still have fealty to Russia and so on. So there's that. We shouldn't forget that. India is complicated. India has a very long relationship with Russia. When India intervened in the war in Pakistan, 1971, toward the creation of Bangladesh, at that time, the Soviets struck an Indo-Soviet peace agreement. In 1993, after the Soviet Union collapsed, India had a peace agreement with Russia. The biggest arms dealers for India is Russia. There's a close relationship. Each of these stories, actually, Rania, is a slightly different story. And I think that's because Russia is a major power in the world, right, and has different relations with everybody. It's not for one, overarching thing. I think if you look down the list, you'll see all kinds of interesting old relationships and old diplomacies at work.
And then I also wanted to ask you, Vijay, about China in this context, because we did see that, for example, after MasterCard and Visa said that they would be cutting off their business in Russia, we saw China's UnionPay come in and kind of like take over. So I'm wondering, do you think China stands to gain from everything that's shifting with this conflict?
I mean, this is interesting. I think the Chinese really, in my opinion, just reading between the lines, okay? I don't have a hotline to Xi Jinping, just as I don't have a hotline to Putin and so on. Whatever people say on Twitter, it's not true. I don't take my orders from Beijing and so on, just to directly put it on the record. But I do feel like reading the record from at least the foreign ministry's public statements, it seems clear that they were not keen on this particular war.
No. Right.
That this war was not exactly what they wanted. Russia and China have been building up a close relationship. They're building up, complementarities in their economy and so on. They're still 10 years away from what I think they would like as a more direct confrontation with the West. And I know the Chinese have been thinking about this because of Taiwan. In China itself, there's a lot of debate about what the implications are for Taiwan in this. China is, in that sense, quite a risk-averse political structure. They don't want to go hard against anybody. Despite what you see from the wolf warrior diplomats, it's a very sober-minded political regime when it comes to international relations. And in general, they are not pro-conflict. But I must say, when Russia entered Syria in September 2015, the Chinese entirely supported that intervention, and Chinese advisors came in and so on. So they have a very close relationship, an entangled, despite a very difficult history going back from the 1950s, when they had a border conflict, the Sino-Soviet split, then the Chinese taking the position of the United States against the Soviet Union from the 70s onward. Despite all that, they have a very close equation now, including economically. But I just don't think they're going to benefit from this in any way that's obvious. I think the only obvious thing is this shows the fragility of US power. This particular intervention has shown the fragility of US power. And perhaps there will be greater confidence in countries around the world not to basically fall prey to many of the kind of seductions of the United States, because they will see that the US has largely abandoned Ukraine. And that is, I think, the message that many countries are taking from this, that they egged this conflict on in Ukraine. And then when the conflict happened, they said, well, we can't do anything. We can sanction Russia, and it's very harsh sanctions against Russia, but they will not get involved to protect any cities or anything. And I think that's the message people are taking. The fragility of US power is, I think, quite clear.
Yeah, I don't think, the sending, obviously, of like almost $1 billion in weapons, obviously, to the Ukrainians should not be taken as something strong. It actually suggests a kind of weakness that abandons Ukraine even further. Not that I want the US to intervene, but you're literally just saying, here's anti-tank missiles, let's prolong the war, and your country is going to be basically like hollowed out as a result of funding and arming an insurgency. So I think that's a really good point. And just as we begin to close here, I have a couple more questions for you, Vijay. I think this has been a lot on the minds of a lot of leftists, and I've mine included, and I worry that Russia's invasion will also damage the imperialist left. I think it already has to some degree, not just in terms of its ability to make effective arguments in an atmosphere of heightened polarization where nuance is now being condemned as, being pro-Putin. But also in that, nationalists and imperialists will be empowered by this. And the voices of socialists and socialist solidarity will be ignored or actively suppressed. And that's kind of already happening. And just to follow up on that point, perhaps is this a concern of maybe white privilege or a Western-centric approach, because the left and the global South will maybe see things differently? What do you think about what this does to the anti-imperialist left?
I mean, I think I take your point that there are great differences in the left in different parts of the world. But I also want to say that the left in general is weak globally, even though, I'm from India. The Communist Party has 1 million members, but that's 1 million members in a country of 1.4 billion. It's a big scale. The left is weak in terms of our political strength. Trade unions have been really weakened globally as a consequence of globalization. That was the reservoir of, the left's strength and so on. So, we need to understand that. And as a consequence of weakness, there's a lot of turning on each other. There's a lot of belief that having the correct, unaccountable idea is best. Having the perfect position is what you strive for. I don't strive for the perfect position. I try to understand things slightly rationally, but also in in understanding where the movements are at, where people are moving, how they are thinking, and so on. The point of the left isn't to have the perfect analysis, but to build power, of the left pole, and have that power linked to a good analysis of the world, so you can build more power and so on. That's what we're think. That's what how we need to think, not tear each other's throats on the perfect analysis, or allow this sort of cancel culture attitude to enter the left. Oh, Rania, you said this yesterday, you're cancelled. I mean, this is a ridiculous liberal attitude, that people aren't allowed to make mistakes, they're not allowed to recover from them. You create a situation of risk averse people just don't want to take a risk in their opinions, and then they'll go along with the status quo. This is the problem with the whole that kind of cancel culture within the left. Culture within the left, I mean, I'm happy with cancel culture if we're dealing with somebody who's a rapist or a racist,
Right.
or whatever it is. Deal with them. I don't mean that. I have no problem with that kind of thing. If somebody is a rapist, they must be dealt with in the way they are dealt with. I don't have I don't want to make this now a debate about that. But in the specific way in which it's entered the left, where you say, oh, I believe this about Ukraine. Well, no, you are outside the bounds of thing. We cancel you. I think that's a problem, because that doesn't allow us as people within the left to explore ideas in public, to think about things, to learn from things. We all make mistakes. I've made mistakes in political judgment many times. I can spend an entire hour with you, talking about the mistakes I've made. Well, if you feel the need to cancel me for that, go ahead and cancel me. I mean, I'll have more time to myself. I'll be able to read the novels I want to read. That's okay. But it's a loss for our movement if we keep canceling each other. So in that sense, Rania, I feel that yes, this is a problem for the anti-imperialist movement, because a war like this is a problem. I'm an anti-war person in general. I will condemn this war. I don't care if you come back and say, oh, therefore I cancel you because you should stand with the Russians. I will never stand with any military force action into another country if all the other means had not previously been exhausted. And as I've already talked about with you, I don't think the government in Russia exhausted all the means. I don't think they built any consent or anything like that. They went in prematurely. That's why the Chinese were upset. That's why Wang Yi said what he said. I'm quite prepared to go on the record saying I think this was a terrible, terrible idea to enter into this conflict. Well, if you think, no, we got to stand with the Russians, that's up to you. I'm not prepared to stand up with anybody who's behaving in this way. I am, of course, I totally understand 100% the atrocities committed against the people in Donbass. I 100% understand the violence of the ultranationalist Nazis operating in the country and so on. I understand all these things, and I understand that there was the Minsk agreement. I understand all that. I'm not, illiterate about these things. On the other hand, there were always other options, and I think those could have been played out. And for instance, politicizing this even more, making the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter hold an international conference on the Donbass could have been interesting. See, now, how are the group of friends of which Russia is a member going to say, let's uphold the UN Charter, when by this military action, Russia has actually violated the UN Charter? If it had gone to the UN Security Council, asked for a resolution, and didn't get it, and then went in, like the US went in Iraq, at least it could say, look, we tried to get a UN Security Council resolution. They didn't even bother to do that, Rania. That must be something we should think about.
Yeah, I know. I think those are all excellent points. And I mean, I think you're right about the canceling. I see, some people in the comments already upset, but it is what it is. I think that we do need to be honest about what could have happened that didn't happen. And so I think those are all important to point out. And you mentioned the weakness of the left all around the world, which is absolutely true, including in the US. But I also find it interesting how much effort has been placed, at least in some corners of the US media, on attacking or antagonizing or trying to bully the left into basically supporting escalation. You've seen a bunch of articles at various outlets, I won't mention them by name, saying, don't be a tanky. I'm not really sure like what's meant by that. I guess you have to support NATO or else you're a tanky. We saw the DSA, for what I thought was a very fine statement, get attacked by a member of the White House Rapid Response Team. We saw the New York Times actually today wrote something about the DSA and how it's caused problems among the progressive Democrats. But what do you think that's about? I mean, the left is weak, so why so much effort on, going after people like us, basically, for being, opposed to the U.S. escalating this war further?
I think they just will not tolerate any criticism of their positions. I mean, that's part of it. There is fear. I mean, I'm not sitting right now in the United States, but I do know that in the United States, there is a lot of anxiety in the Democratic Party about the DSA International Committee, the influence it's having on young people and so on. There are so many young Marxist YouTubers in the United States. They are having their own impact. And I think they are afraid of that kind of thing. The resurgence of left thinking in the United States. The New York Times article was quite comical, actually. I thought the Intercept article by Rowan Carey was also quite ridiculous. Going after tankies, not naming anybody. And by the way, tankies, you know who the biggest tankies are? The pro-war people who want American Abrams tanks to enter Iraq, who want American Abrams tank to enter Libya, who want American Abrams tanks to enter Ukraine and so on. What tanks, I get called a tanky all the time, and I'm saying, what tanks am I supporting? Frankly, tell me, which tank have I supported? You're the ones who support tanks and you're calling me a tanky? Give me a break. You're the ones who are saying, standing there. It's like a bad Monty Python skit. They're standing there with the green flag, telling other people to go and fight the wars that they fantasize about.
Right.
And then you're turning around and yelling at me and calling me a tanky because I'm trying to stop the tanks from crossing. I mean, that's the ridiculousness of it. You see, right now, the left doesn't have the capacity for a frontal contest with a lot of these forces because they have media power, they have the power over the cultural institutions, they have power over political and diplomatic institutions and so on. That's the reason why I was saying that the Russians didn't try to build consent. This doesn't mean the UN is a perfect institution. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that you've got to use whatever institutions are available to you to build some consent. You've got to hold international conferences on the Nazi threat. You've got to do all those things.
Yeah.
Those were not done. I mean, it's key. Venezuela on the 11th of April is holding an anti-fascist conference. That's important to do. There've got to be more of these things. There's got to be more international concern about the rise of fascist groups, not only in Ukraine, but across Europe in general, in the United States. I mean, I saw, I'm part of the team that does the International Red Books Day. We had, 500,000 people in Kerala read communist books. In Rhode Island, a small left-wing library did a reading of the manifesto, and they were attacked by neo-Nazis in Providence, Rhode Island. This is all a concern, and this should be at the center of things. The Nazis that are rising in Brazil, the Nazis that are rising in India, the Hindu right is very much a kind of Nazi-esque ideology. We need build international consent against Nazism. That's a project for us. So I would tell the left, rather than tear each other's heads off, why not combine together and create a global anti-Nazi project, a united front or a popular front against Nazism. And you include in that whole Nazi camp, you got to include many of these liberals for whom their liberalism is skin deep. And I'm using the word skin purposely. It's skin deep. They are worried about what they call blue-eyed, blonde-haired children in Ukraine suffering. They think it's perfectly normal for our children in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Congo, and so on to die. I'm going to ask your listeners, Rania, very quickly, we saw the flag of Ukraine People may not have known the flag before, but suddenly yellow and gold became common. I want your listeners to admit honestly, how many of them know what the flag of the Democratic Republic of the Congo looks like? Millions of people killed in the Great Lakes War in the Congo. Millions of people. How many of you know what the flag of the Congo looks like? And how many of you have posted it on Facebook? I believe it's zero.
Right. And of course, millions of people killed in many cases due to the actions of companies, corporations that are connected to Western countries. And of course, that's why it doesn't get attention. There's no imperial benefit to publicizing the killings in a place like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think that's such an excellent point that you made. And just, one last question to you, Vijay, to bounce off of that is, with our attention so focused on Russia and Ukraine, are there other events around the world we are neglecting and upon which we should focus so as not to be, Eurocentric? And by this, of course, I mean other events that are perhaps happening in the so-called uncivilized nations, as our many liberal media personalities have made clear they believe they're uncivilized.
I mean, I don't even know where to begin, Rania. Let's be honest. 463 million children have no access to the internet because they either don't have electricity, don't have gadgets, don't have wireless or landlines or even cellular and so on. 463 million children. 1.5 billion children were impacted by the pandemic for their education. 2.7 billion people can't eat, don't know when they'll get their next meal, okay? The government of Burundi, a country in Africa, 12 odd million people, the government of Burundi says at the current rate of vaccination, they will reach 70% of the country vaccinated in January 2100. January 2100, okay? You want problems? There are many in the world, but there's no impact, no focus on them. The focus is on manufactured crises. Now, I'm not saying the crisis in Ukraine is manufactured. This is a real problem. It's a real conflict. But don't let it make us forget these other systematic issues. And obviously, how can we forget that there is an ongoing war in Yemen, ongoing war in Congo, ongoing war in Somalia? What is happening to the Palestinians? This, that, and the other. So interesting, Rania, that a visual goes viral online of a young girl confronting a soldier. And the headline of the thing is, Ukrainian girl challenges Russian soldier. Turns out she's not Ukrainian. That's Ehed Tamimi, who's a young, at the time, 11-year-old Palestinian girl challenging an Israeli soldier. Okay, Palestinian lives matter. Not really. Not at all.
Indeed. Well, Vijay, also real quick, can you remind everybody where they can follow along with your excellent work? Because it's at so many different places.
Well, in fact, people can go and look at thetricontinental.org. It's a bit of a mouthful, but if you Google Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, you'll get there. And also, of course, I write for Globetrotter, which is a global syndication service. So have a look at these places and keep watching Breakthrough News. It's a lot better than MSNBC and certainly better than some of the left liberal outfits. Shall I name them? Better leave it unsaid.
Well, we'll be the diplomatic ones here. Also, real quick, I just want to thank all the people who threw out money in the super chat. I'm sorry I didn't get to say your comment on air. I promise with these live streams, I'll get better about doing that. But thank you, everybody who tuned in and watched. And Vijay, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure. Yeah.